pictures in your household, one of Jesus Christ and one of that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So as a kid growing up, I learned all of the stories about the civil rights movement. My father, being a Black studies professor, brought me all sorts of cartoon books on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So from my grandmother, who was raised in Vicksburg, Mississippi, who left the era of Jim Crow to move west to raise her family, to my mother, who got a chance to have a glimpse of him when he spoke at Carver Middle School in Los Angeles, California, and listening to my father as a professor talk about his legacy. I have been, I promise you, I thought I was there with him when he was marching, although I wasn't born yet. I turn it over to President Dr. Young.
Well, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. So, you know, that's where he was assassinated at. And so my mother actually walked with Dr. King. We were very entrenched into civil rights. My father actually went to school with Medgar Evers. And so we were entrenched. My aunt was a Black Panther in Oakland. So civil rights runs deep in my veins. And so my mother actually walked with Dr. King, and she tells me the stories that when he passed, she remembers being in the house and the day stood still in our community. Nobody moved anywhere because the greatest hope that we had been assassinated. And to go back home now and to let my children see the monuments of where he was shot at, and be able to tell them the story of how this began. And he began this life in civil rights at such a young age. And so it's very important and imperative that we bring young people into this, because we need that youth voice. Like Omar stated earlier, sometimes you have to move on to give presence and give way to young voices. And Dr. King was that young voice that started with the NAACP at 16. So we got to start grooming, leaders got to start making leaders, right? And so that's how I got entrenched in knowing about Dr. King. Like Omar said, in your house, there was always a picture of the white Jesus and the Black Martin. And so we are we are here to so that's just where I was. That's where I came from. I'm from the South, so that's where the civil rights movement was moving, and so that's where we've seen it.
Thank you, and those are great stories. Mr. Tafari, how about you? What was your experience?
It all began, when I was quite young, in elementary school back in the early '60s. During that time, Africa was in the brink of literally liberating itself from European colonialism, and the father of Africa was Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and he galvanized all newly formed African states to form the the Organization of African Union. And being Ethiopia has never been colonized, and the fact many countries looked up to Ethiopia to kind of sort of as a pathway to freedom, and the Organization of African Union was formed in 1963. And I was, like I said, I was quite young, and as a elementary school student, we were, had a uniform and lined up on the streets to greet all these new head of states from all over Africa. And it was during that time of this exhilaration throughout Africa, in particular in Ethiopia, about Africanism, Blackness. It was a very historic moment for many of us, because Africa was being born, you could almost say that, out of colonialism and getting its own independence. This identity, is cross-boundary, cross-culture African unity. Then it was echoed from this man we've never heard of, named Dr. Martin Luther King, a very eloquent man, speaking about the suffering of the African Americans in the United States. And when you merge these two historical event, it's almost an earth shaking in a sense of Black awareness, empowerment, and our plight throughout history for freedom, equality, and integrity and whatnot. And there wasn't anyone, who could articulate this. And we were hearing it as if he's speaking about our own suffering in Africa.
Mm.
And no one can say the things that he was saying. And at the same time, he was the one who opened the gate for us to understand the suffering of the African American people throughout history here in the United States. We didn't come to learn, most of us, in school about the suffering. It was Martin Luther King's speech, why this man was so passionate, why he was so eloquent and so effective in the way he conveyed this to the world, as if we were listening to it, as if he was actually talking to us. And if in a truest sense, growing up, I've developed an affinity with the Black America as we identified ourselves at that time, this awakening that we're seeing in Africa at the same time. So that was my first early impression. And I was maybe a young 10-year-old boy in Ethiopia, but you can imagine the impression this giant was making to, for people like me. And so I would say, I'll say that's the first time I heard him. And then followed later on that we used to recite his "I Have a Dream" speech later on, as if it was spoken for us, and we were able to translate it in Amharic, in our official Ethiopian language. So that is the impact he has, and I don't know if many people know, living here in the United States, that this man actually spoke to the world. In remote villages in Africa, this man was heard. He was like a messiah that has come to liberate Africans and people of our skin everywhere in the world, not only in the United States. And so that was my first experience of knowing him.
Yes, thank you, and thank you. That was a great story, and I think you've made the connection of what the essence of what we're trying to do here, which is building that bridge between those two communities. And as you just said, and I think that bridge has been there since a long time, and that throughout the civil rights movements, we see that a lot of the civil rights movement leaders were also involved in the freedom movement that was going on within the African continent. But I want to come back. I know when Dr. Young was speaking earlier, she said MLK was seen as the greatest hope. Who was also assassinated. And today, here we are in the country celebrating Dr. Luther King. And he may be the only one, he is the only one who has actually a day just for himself that is celebrating him in a country that rejected his ideas, his fighting, and what he stood for, and assassinated him. Do you look at that as is that a testimony of how far we've come, or is there also a testimony of how how far we still have to go? Dr. Young, I think you made it.
I think this seeing how far, it says how far we have to go. We can see insurrection that happened over 2 weeks ago. That shows us that we are not where we should be, right? We should never have to have these arguments and fights. I'm sure that it was this hope that at this time we wouldn't even need to have an NAACP, because there would be equality between all people. So I think it speaks to how far we are behind. we're looking at 2021, and we're doing the same things that happened in 1965, you know, against people. So we know there's a long road ahead of us, and now it's a time to begin to get new leadership that understands this, like I said, putting younger people in there and even using us to really move this vision how it needs to happen. Was that your question? But I
Yes.
think that's where we have to be, really trying to move the vision, because the work has just begun. Because we can see that from 1965, 2021, we still see the same things happening. And so therefore there's a problem. So where's our leadership now? Who was going to lead us to the next leg? How do we lead our own communities to the next leg of equality? And so I think that's where we are right now. The work has just began.
Thank you. And Dr. Omar, I want to talk to you about the I Have a Dream speech, right? Because a lot of people have taken that speech and made it basically the entire legacy of Dr. King to a certain point, right? And I also want to touch a little bit on the letter from a Birmingham jail. And even that I Have a Dream speech, when a lot of people talk about the dream, it seems as though people don't want to talk about the situations that actually gave birth to that dream, what was really happening. But a lot of people just try to look at that dream and talk about the opportunities that we were looking ahead without really talking about what was going on, the struggles that actually forced us, or forced Martin Luther King to actually have to dream that reality that could have been a reality in which he could have lived in.
That's a, you know, historically, when you look at let's do it in let's do it in order. With the letter from a Birmingham jail, let's understand that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in jail, let's talk about what he was in jail for. He was in jail because there was a gentleman by the name of Bull Connor, who was the sheriff in Birmingham, Alabama. And when they went down there to talk about civil rights, to talking about being a voice for the voiceless, the only thing they did was walk the street and kneel down and pray. I'm going to tell you what they were arrested for. Walking the street, kneeling down and praying. They didn't commit no violent act, but they had dogs sicked on them. They were being hit with nightsticks. Oh, by the way, does that sound like some protest that we had today? But let me just keep moving. I don't want to, you know, switch it up a little bit, but he went to jail. And it was clergy in Birmingham that said, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., why are you coming here using your reverend pulpit to cause this trouble? So he wrote to that clergy and said, if you were true people of the cloth, if you were true people of Christianity or whatever faith you belong with, you'll be in jail with me standing up for what is right. That set the premise for the March on Washington, which was really set up by youth. Let's understand this. It was SNCC. It was a few other organizations that was there. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sort of came in the planning process later, gave one of the best speeches we hear today, one of the most celebrated speeches, because he already had been in jail. He already had been hit with the nightsticks. His house had already been bombed. He had already been stabbed. And finally, someone gets up there and say, you know what? We have to have the dream to make it a reality, because right now is not a reality. And later came the Civil Rights Bill of 1964.
Yes, thank you for that historic lesson. I mean, I hope everybody who's watching us on Facebook is actually taking notes, because whew, that was powerful. Mr. Tafari, coming back to you, could you tell us a little bit, and I want to get this from the perspective of an African who has migrated to the United States, right? And just saying that an African is today able to migrate to the United States, that is thanks to the civil rights movement, right? So coming from that perspective, how far do you think we have come, and how far do we still have to go?
Good. It's really, really, truly an important topic to talk about. You know, the history of immigration for the United States. It's a land of immigrants. Everybody came from somewhere willingly, with except the slaves. And so the immigration policy of the United States historically has been to favor European immigrants. And the latest act of the century, the last century, was in the 1920, the Immigration Act of 1921, which pretty much made over 90% of the people that are immigrated to the United States to come from Europe. And so people like us, Africans and Asians in particular, we were shut out. Literally, we were shut out, and particularly from Africa, because in most African countries were also already colonized. So not only that they were not allowed to come to the United States, but they never even can leave Africa itself because we were colonized and they wouldn't allow us to leave. So therefore, the civil rights movement of 1965 and the 1960s, led by many leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King, not only brought the civil rights, the changes that need to take place, the Voting Rights Act, desegregating schools, and all of the things that we have, been able to enjoy now. But it also opened the gate of immigration historically has been shut out for people of Africa and Asia. Thanks to the civil rights movement. Today, Papa Dia, you and I would not have come to United States if it was not for the African Americans who paid in blood and flesh for the changes that need to take place to rewrite the Immigration Act of 1920, and it finally signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. That said, essentially allowed, that if the African American population at that time ranges anywhere between 8 to 11%, how come the immigration number does not reflect the population of the Black Africans in the United States? It is that opportunity that opened the gate for the first time. Africans freely, by choice, were able to immigrate. Everywhere I go, I remind my community, my brothers and sisters from the other African states, we owe the great deal of gratitude to African Americans for us even to be breathed in America, to be here in America, to have an opportunity, to have the dream. Therefore, if it was not for the Civil Rights Movement that incorporated the Immigration Act of 1965, that ultimately opened the door for us to freely immigrate to the United States, we would all be in Africa or in Asia. In fact, the biggest beneficiaries of the Immigration Act of 1965, more than even actually African descent, are Asians. So I would like to say to also Asian Americans, especially the first immigrants that have come since then, they owe a great deal of gratitude to the struggle of African Americans to open the gate for them to immigrate to the United States. You see, this is what has changed America as well. So 40, 50 years later, somebody comes down on the elevator down to basically make a political point of condemning people that have immigrated from other countries as criminals and seeking political capital as a result of it, because it shows how much the country has opened up. It shows how we have integrated. And we also need to know that our destiny in the future, not only just now, but for our children's destiny, is intertwined with the struggle of African Americans. We need to understand the history, the suffering, the challenges, and our struggle cannot be just an isolated struggle. There is no space for us to create that on our own in America unless we are adding ourselves with the struggle and the suffering of the African American.
Yes.
Their success is our success. It is them that we always tag with for us to go anywhere, to be somebody. And that's where I make the connection. That, you know, the struggle here in the United States in the early 60s in particular, it was actually echoing the freedom of Africans in Africa itself. At the same time, the changes they enforced and ultimately passed and signed by Lyndon Johnson is the one that opened the door. People who look like us only came here as slaves. Thanks to the struggle of the civil rights movement, that we were able to willingly, as a free man, be able to come to America because of that struggle and the price that was paid during the Civil War, and before that too. So this is how I connected, and I want to make sure that the young people, you know, I have 3 children, they're all Americans, and they are Black Americans with Ethiopian heritage. That's how I tell them. You need to know your history from Ethiopia, but you also need to know the history of Black America, okay? Because they are born here, and that we're giving them to inherit the history and the suffering of our brothers and sisters for the last 300 years, what they have paid in blood and flesh.
Yes, thank you.
And so that's how I connect it.
Yes, thank you. And that was a great background of the connection and a testimony of how that connection goes. I want to just keep going into that direction a little bit, because now once African immigrants were able to Africans were able to migrate to the United States, we've seen in recent years that we can say the experience of the African immigrant has in some ways been used against that experience of the Black American, right? We've seen clips of journalists saying, well, if a Nigerian immigrant is able to come here and succeed, why can't a Black American succeed? When we know that the situations is way different, how do we make sure that our African immigrants who migrate here understand, right, the background and the baggage, the historical baggage that comes with being born in this country and being an African American? And how also do we make sure that our African Americans are understanding where our African immigrants are coming from, and make sure that we are building that connection and understanding each other? Dr. Yang.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I thought you said something else. I think it's just like where we stand right now with white fragility. It comes in telling and teaching, right? And so we have so many people now that we call allies. And what we need is accomplished. We need people that stand with us and people that understand the struggle. And we speak of that of Native Africans coming to America. It is up to you to, like the professor spoke earlier, to train them, to tell them the story, right? That's how the information gets out. If we say these same things to the white majority that says, if you want to know the knowledge, study the knowledge, find the knowledge, it applies to everyone. It does not just apply to them, it applies to any culture that comes here. And to realize that America, African slaves that came to become African Americans, our story, where did our story start? And how did our story start? We know that we really are the most indigenous people. Because when I think about Christopher Columbus bringing the ship here, who led the ship and who steered the ship was an African man that did that. So that tells me he had been here before, so he must have knew the roadmap to get here again. So I think it all comes in us educating each other us as African Americans really educating about the history, and you telling us the history of the struggle, and us telling us being able to tell you our struggle as African Americans back to Africa. And it's all, like I said, it's all in learning. And that's how we all become accomplices to each other instead of just being allies. Because allies that speak words, right? Allies to me are just conversationalists. And until we get people that actually walk with us hand in hand, arm in arm, then we won't be able to tell the story and to move on.
Yes. Dr. Omar.
You know, I really love that question because bridging the gap between our African and African American brothers and sisters is something that Papa and different members of the Ethiopian community, the Ugandan community, the Nigerian community, Liberian community, these are all different communities. The NAACP purposefully try to partner with, not just because there's a need, but there's shared information that we need from each other to understand and grow from each other. We know that the Western Sudanic region during the time of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai was when the majority of the people that was captured and was brought to the United States went to the Caribbean where they were trained to be broken, then brought to the United States. We also know that the Horn of Africa, where you have Egypt, Ethiopia, Somalia, some of these other countries, is where history began, is where you began to look at monolithic religions, where you began to understand politics, where you began to talk about the formation of Christianity, Islam, and some of these other religions, because these were the thinkers, these were the geniuses of our time. So let's understand something. A successful Africa means there's successful African Americans, because we're still learning our history. It took me to do a 23 and DNA test to find out what part of Africa my ancestors come from. And most of it was Nigeria, some of it was Ghana. So for me, it is in my interest that when Africans come to the United States, one, that they understand that there are African Americans who want to be there with them and be allies. In the same way, when I go to Africa, that the Africans that are there, the part of the continent I'm visiting, know I'm coming there as an ally. I'm coming home because I claim the whole continent. So let me say this, I claim the whole continent. So for me, when I hear about civil unrest on a continent, it hurts me just as much as gang violence do in the United States. It hurt me just as much when I see disenfranchisement in the United States when I see it on the continent. So it is to my benefit that the civil war that they just talked about in the Congo, that we take the principles of Martin Luther King there so that we can have a nonviolent movement to bring those groups together. You hear about the civil unrest in Uganda. How do we begin to bridge those groups together using the principles of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? And how do we bring we're talking about Ethiopia, the Amara and the Tigray. How do we bring all these groups together to have nonviolent movements to help the humanitarian issues in one of the most important countries in Africa? Not saying the others are not, but when you talk about the Horn, you talk about the Nile River. How do we begin African Americans and Africans working together, not just for the African American in the United States, but for the continent and the African diaspora as a whole?
Wow.
Thank you.
All right, Papa, I've been looking at you and I know you fired up. You probably wanna chime in. I wanna let you chime in, but I also want you to let us know, when are we going to take Dr. Omar to Africa?
Well, Amadou, and I said this from the beginning, we couldn't have better and stronger people than the one we have on today, talking about, and I like how you deliberately elevate everybody to doctor, because everything that they say here come from a doctor, and from Deacon Youssef, Omar, and Sandra, you know, everything that you said came from experience. And when you hear Deacon talk about the civil rights movement, that's what liberated Africa, because you got to understand, in the 60s, that's when Africans start having their independence from colonialism. So who did we learn that from? We learned it from the civil rights movement. And Amadou, look, because I can't top anything that's been said here. I'm not even going to try to go there. For me, I just want to ask a question. And I know Omar, Deacon, and Sandra, we've been talking about this. Now, looking at what transpired in the current environment that we are in the country right now, and being solution-oriented, what could be our role? Like Omar, you as the president, and Deacon Youssef, what could be our role in the current environment that we are in this country with the leadership to make sure that this country can move forward? Because if we look at what's happening in this country, where the United States was positioned to be the country that would give lesson to African countries, and right now everybody is so ashamed of what transpired, what could be our role to move forward with the current situation? And Dr. Sandra, I'll start with you. What could be personally our role?
Well, I'm going to have to go back to what Dr. Omar said, and what I said earlier. It comes with allyship, and I say accomplice. I call people accomplices instead of allies, but it comes with us really working together, moving the vision that we need to move. We know that freedoms and liberations are not given, they're taken, and they're demanded, and then we work on those demands, and we work together with those. So I think coming together as united forces, we got to be on the same page. We want the same results, right? At the end of the day, we want the same results for our family, we're going to go from the classroom to the boardroom. How do we get there unitedly? And the minute that we see that we are one, you know, that's the song, right? We are one, and we all come together and work for a collective ending, then we get where we need to go. And we have to stop having the division. The bridge has got to be burned, okay? We are one. And once the minute that we understand that and teach that, then we can move forward to move to the next level. Like Omar said, our country is bleeding right now. Africa is bleeding. It is up to us to fix those problems for our own people. You know, America is bleeding. It is up to Africa to see that we need their help too. Black America is bleeding, I should say. And so as we figure out that we are one and begin the allyship or accomplishment of working together, that's the only way that we can move ahead. And understand that we are going to work with each other and not against each other. And that has always been the pit, working against each other instead of with each other. And it's going to take that collaboration together to really make this happen.
That's well said. Dr. Omar, let me come to you. And Amadou asked this question earlier. With all the hard work that's been done during the civil rights movement, where we felt like we made a lot of progress, and here we are in 2021, and I think we are in a worse situation than we were in the 60s, where people are scared, people feel threatened. What is your message to our community, to the white extremists and all the nationalists, and how can we respond to the threat?
The same way we've always responded to violence, with love, education, patience, and understanding. Love will always eradicate hate. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, the dark cannot take out the dark. You need light to take out the dark. So you need love to take out hate. We cannot keep duplicating some of the same things that are taking place. So you have the group that went out to the Capitol. Let's think about this. They went out to the Capitol, had an insurgent, and went out and did all sorts of things of hurting the military police that was out there, those that were out there for a peaceful demonstration and was trying to tell people to calm down. Those people got hurt, and then went in there and tried to threaten the leadership of the country. Now, let's understand this. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have said, let's march in peace. We have to continue to march in peace. We have to continue to feed those that are hungry. We have to continue to uplift those that are poor. We have to continue to be the voice for those that are disenfranchised. And we do that even in the midst of things looking so chaotic. There's despair out there where people have lost hope because of what is taking place. Let me tell you this. We must continue to stay strong with love. We must continue to stay strong with peace. We must continue to be a voice for the voiceless, whether if it's here in the United States, if it's in the continent of Africa, if it's in the Caribbean. If there are people being disenfranchised anywhere, then that means humanity must stand together as allies. And we must lock arms, not just with our African and African-American brothers and sisters, our white allies. We got to bring our Muslims and Christians together. We got to bring Republicans and Democrats together. We have to all stand in alliance, arm in arm, against anyone in this world that's being disenfranchised. So I say that to say, we must be a model like we're doing today. Brother Jeff has called a call and say, we're feeding 1,000 people. We don't care what you look like and who you are. That's what you hear all the noise in the background. If you're hungry, you need to be fed. Next, we got to get these people jobs. So the same people that's feeding them, how do we give them jobs? And last but not least, how do we give them more than hope? How do we give them something substantial to let them know that this country loves them and that we as a people love them, and we're going to continue to lift them up no matter how far they fall?
Well said. And Deacon, I'm going to come to you, and I have this very specific question for you. As an African immigrant that migrated here years ago, what do you think could be the role of African immigrant in this current situation where we have white nationalists, extremists, where there's misinformation that's being fed to everybody? What could be the role of an African immigrant? Either you are here as documented, undocumented, or citizen, but what could be our role in front of the situation, working with the African American and also working with the white people?
Well, to me, where we are at as a whole, if you look at, if you go into higher elevation and have a bird's eye view of what's happening, it seems like the universal truth and universal solutions that society needs to have is being challenged by literally a 21st century tribalism, whether it is done in the form of ideology or whatnot, where it is really creating a parallel universe where one does not hear the other universe and are not even aware that it exists. Where there is, we see that alternative facts or alternative truth being accepted as truth. This affects universally everyone, because this is a huge problem, so we as immigrants, we need to identify ourselves and really understand where our interests lie. As an African American, as an African immigrant, we are first and foremost, we are African Americans. We are treated as such. We are viewed as such. The biases and all other liabilities affects us just as the same, whether it is superficial, whether it is intentively, but studied and executed to hurt our interest. Our predisposition is 100% aligned with the interest of African American. That doesn't mean we need to create, an echo chamber that unless someone who looks like us cannot be part of our world, or vice versa. The truth is, the civil rights movement itself, one of the things that it shows us, it is, even though it is led by African Americans, it had a very broad coalition. That coalition has grown and has lived till the present. And even today, the greatest challenge that civil rights accomplishments has faced politically what made the success is the coalition is still being intact. So it was whites, blacks, Asians, and all other member of society coming together, knowing the fact their interests lie the same. Like Dr. Omar said, when somebody gets hungry, we get hungry too. And this realization that the harm that comes to society, it doesn't have a patent only to harm one particular group. And therefore, that if we hold hand in hand, create the bridge, make the understanding that the only way we can tackle this challenge, which I identified at the beginning of this discussion, which is now we're really completely are facing that society is really compartmentalized in such a way. The news feed that we get, first of all, is questionable whether it's actually news material. Great majority of the medias that we hear are opinions, not news. They don't show science or facts, and therefore these fundamental important pillars of society, when they get compromised, then our universe gets compromised. Yes. Because we're creating in single instead of having a single universe that we all share, we're creating a parallel universe that doesn't speak to itself. So all of a sudden, you'll see people just like we saw last week, where based on the information they got, based on that universe parallel that they're in, they really thought they're saving America, where they saw, we all saw them, storming the Capitol and creating the man that we saw. And so we feel, to answer your question, is we cannot isolate ourselves as just African immigrants. We need to identify ourselves and look in the mirror and say, as long as I live in the United States, my interests lie with the interests of African Americans in particular, but with other people as well. So instead of trying to live in this compartmentalized universe, we need to make sure that we insist on having one universal, because truth is universal, science is universal, and people's interest is universal, and that's the sort of the take for me as an immigrant, in the way that I advise my community and guide myself really by these principles in the way that I see how I can exist in the United States.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for enlightening us. We have almost come to the end of the show, and I know, Dr. Omar, you have to leave us at 12:30 sharp. So I want to end this last question with you. I would like to give you the chance to give your last message and your last word, but I also would like to wrap in just this question, right? I want to know, what does progress look like? Because and every time I have these conversations, the rebuttal I get is, well, this is the same country that elected a Black American as the president. This is the same country that elected a Black woman now as vice president. But I actually would qualify all those events as, let's just say, the election of Barack Obama as actually the renaissance of racism in the United States. So what does progress look like? And also, if you would give us your last message to the community.
Progress looks like, I said the other day that in Aurora, there's a life-size statue of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. right around the corner from where I'm at. I'm at the Dayton Opportunity Center, but right around the corner on Colfax, there's a life-size statue of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At different times, there's people sleeping in tents, people that are homeless, people who've lost hope. Kids that are supposed to be in school don't know where they're sometimes going to get their next meal now that schools have been virtual. Parents don't have jobs because their factories is closed up because of COVID. So to me, progress is, how do we band together as a country and begin to figure out how to uplift the downtrodden, those who have lost all hope, and not just here in the United States. We have to remember the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke up about disenfranchisement and uplifting people worldwide. So in the Dominican and in Haiti, where they're still recovering from the earthquakes, how do we band arms and uplift those individuals and let them know that we haven't forgot about them? Those in Puerto Rico, which is supposed to be a part of the United States, where we have a tourist industry that's doing okay, but people around the tourist industry are still poor. We're in Washington, D.C., where we have the White House and the Capitol, but still have one of the largest, poorest, homeless Black population in the United States. So we have to begin to look at it from a rural perspective. And then we have to begin to have the very tough conversations. And I know, I may be saying some things that may get under some people's skin, but the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wouldn't have it no other way. Once again, how do we bring our Ugandan brothers and sisters together to stop that civil war? How do we begin to continue to uplift Ghana, Liberia, and Syria alone, where they have beginning to face challenges because of COVID? And how do we begin to help our country, the mother of civilization, Ethiopia? Let's bring the Amara and Tigray together, and let's begin to figure out, how do we stop the humanitarian issues that are going on there? Because if Ethiopia is successful, Egypt is successful, the surrounding countries are successful. So it's more than just talking about what's here in the United States. It is global upliftment, global love, global courageous conversations, and all of us being allies and accomplices to make it happen so that we can have peace worldwide and have a loving world.
Thank you. Every time you just leave me speechless, I'll just hand it out to Dr. Yang.
I don't want to follow Dr. Omar anymore, okay? I want to speak before Dr. Omar gets started, okay? I think it should be Reverend Omar. But I want to just piggyback off of what he said. Hope is where we start. And so many people have lost that. And when you lose hope, you can't go on. We know that America has the lowest rates of African Americans owning homes, which goes into their economic development, right? Mm-hmm. We know that our kids have the lowest educational rates, which goes into our economic development again. We know that we have not been able to have global learners, and we've seen through COVID-19 that there was such a digital divide even between our communities that our kids could not learn. We have the highest rates of infant mortality in Black women. How do we bring hope to those things? We see COVID-19 spoke to just healthcare in general, how it's coming to our communities. How do we speak to that? How do we speak to healthy living? How do we speak to healthy eating? How do we speak to free food resources in our community? Like, those are things that we can also look for hope, because we bring the voice of the hopeless, right? And so we want to look at even how their civil rights are looked at. We have the highest amount of Black men in jail. We need our brothers out of jail. So we need to be looking at recidivism programs. That brings hopes to families when you can have a man, your father, in the household. I think that as we go forward, we look at how we get our homeless off the streets. America is a rich country. People should not be laying on the streets, not eating, not having a place to stay. We can just look at Denver, Colorado. Let's just look at Colorado in general. We know that Colorado is a rich state. And so we have a growing population of homelessness happening. How do we stop that? And I think that's what Dr. King was talking about, the hope. You know what, we got to keep hope. Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive. And if we can keep hope alive in people to know that they can go to the next step, we'll see change. Because that was who Dr. King was. He brought hope to that whole southern region, beginning the civil rights movement, because we had no hope. Coming from the South, I can tell you the stories of even going to Mississippi, where my father's from, and you can see you can feel the oppressed nature when you go down there and see how people hung from trees. You know, my father would say he would go to school, but by the time school was out, he'd see African American men, his friends, hanging from trees on the way home from school. So those people don't have hope. How do we bring hope to those people that are just around our communities every day? What we do daily, and putting something in somebody's life daily, speaking into somebody's life. I think those are the small things that we want to save the world. And I agree. I'm not talking against what Omar said, but how do we save the people sitting next to us? There's a scripture in the Bible that says, how do you love me, but you don't even love your neighbor? So how do we speak hope into our neighbors? What can I do to help you? How can I get you in school? How can I help your mother and your father go the extra way with you? How do we keep kids out of jail? How do we stop the school to prison pipeline in our own communities? And I think that's where we began this hope mission. How do we help one another? How do we help my brother that's laying on the ground outside of MLK Library, where we're going today? How do we help them to get off the ground? Because they have jobs, how do we help them to get to the next move of their life? How do we get them out of jail successfully, right? How do we get kids to be able to speak languages and have enough education to get into schools to move that way, or either become entrepreneurs? How do we give into their lives? And I that's what hope looks like to me. That's what reform, that's what transformation is, helping those that are next to us that need our help.
Yes, yes, thank you. That was amazing. Mr. Tafari.
Well, it's hard to add anything more, honestly. I just wanted to say, finally, something that always has been in my mind many times when I have an opportunity to meet young people, mainly African Americans. There are a few things that I'd like to share with them. And I need to bring this up in order just to say, if there is one thing that stands out and it breaks our heart every time we see, is look at the African immigrant life and the African Americans. And one thing that stands out being vividly different is in the way our families are structured. Um, Even as immigrants and diaspora, we have a very limited number of people from each country in a given community, very finite, but somehow we manage to establish a union and a marriage where the father stays in the family and is a very key contributor and a pillar to the children's life. We see, it breaks our heart to see that our African American mothers and sisters not having that partnership, that it seems that they have to lift everything on their own, still face all the hardships and all the prejudice outside, left only to them to bring their children to become somebody. And that's a hard thing to lift. If happens in Caribbean, it happens in Africa, it happens anywhere in the world. If it is left to what Black American women deal in a broad sense, I don't think any one of us could have made it, much less come here and thrive. And so somehow we need to address this. And how, and I know that is above my pay grade, but I see this as one of the biggest problem that seems to feed itself. And in society's prejudice that penalizes African men is obvious, and then compound that into how that impacts again the core, that family, its ability to be able to provide to the children so they don't have to go through what they went through, the previous generation went through. And I would just say this finally. Most Africans, include me, when we come to America and we aspire to live the American dream, and the thing that pushes us is this concept about what can I do so that the hardship that I went through in life, that relatively will not repeat itself to my children. So that is the biggest motivation factor. So we need to make this a major issue that needs to be addressed to really to help the mothers, and at the same time to forecast and promise that the children that are coming with a father figure at the center can benefit just like many of the African immigrants families benefit. And that is, but how that is done, as like I said, it's way above my pay grade, but we need to address it. We need to face it. Unless we address the situation, everything else is seem to be secondary to me. But I am honored to be invited here with these distinguished thinkers and intellectuals and civic leaders. It's been an honor, and I owe my presence here and my fellow Ethiopians and Africans in general to the struggle of the civil rights movement that allowed us to enter here and have this opportunity. And thank you again.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Tafari. Thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you, Dr. Sandra, for joining us. And Papa as well. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And yes, this was our panel that we had for you on MLK Day. And I know this conversation was very educative for me. I hope everyone out there took notes. And we know that we've come far, but we also have a lot more to go. And as Dr. Sandra said, there's a lot that we have to do. We still have a long way to go, and we have a lot of challenges that we need to address. And the best way to do that is to come together as a society, come together as a nation, but also to bring our two communities together and make sure that we build one stronger community so that we can address those challenges within us. As he said, you have to love your neighbor first before we reach out and go further and build our society and make it a stronger one. Thank you, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of your ALG Weekly.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Deacon. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We are off Facebook now.
Dr. Amadou J, you did very well as a host. So, Sandra, thank you. And Deacon, I think this was a great conversation.
Dr. Young, you muted.
And very, very educative. Very educative. So, Deacon, thank you.
I hope I was clear in my conveying the message, and hopefully that people understood what I was saying. But I thank you so much.
You are
Great job. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. Thank you. Amadou, good job. That was this is one of the best, and you did very well.
Thank you.
On your question, it was a great show, and now that's like tomorrow will be also something like this that you will need to get ready and prepare for. So, but today was great.
All right, great.
All right, we will talk later. And you got a lot of viewers and people that was following it online. So this is good. So definitely get it on YouTube, and people will want to watch it later. So.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.